If this is the position of the French and British governments, there will be no peace.
No.
I don't like the idea of not having something to enforce an agreement, but I think we have to get Russian cooperation. But putting an offensive European force in Ukraine is something Russia will never agree to, and could be a guarantee that the war will never end.
Now, Fred Fleitz is one of the architects of Donald Trump's foreign policy. He's vice chair of the America First Policy Institute Center for American Security. He wrote a paper about ending the war in Ukraine. His co-author was Keith Kellogg. He's now the U.S. envoy for Kyiv and Moscow. So let me go straight to Fred Fleitz. And I ask you this. Do you think, does Donald Trump have a clear idea of what an acceptable peace plan would look like?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think the problem in looking at Trump's approach to ending the war in Ukraine is that he has long said, long before he won the election, that his priority is to stop the killing in a war he believes Ukraine cannot win because it has become a long-term war of attrition. On the other hand, we've seen from European states and from the Biden administration a policy of giving Ukraine weapons for as long as it takes, with no plan or no desire to end the war. I don't know how that was ever going to end the war. I don't think there was a plan. Trump is trying to get both sides to the table, and he said in his speech to Congress on Wednesday that the U.S. is also engaged in intensive discussions with Russia. Now, trying to end the war, end the killing, this doesn't make Trump anti-Ukraine or pro-Russia. I think it is the most appropriate and most moral approach for a war that is killing large numbers of Ukrainians, that eventually Ukraine's going to lose because it's running out of troops.
Well, it would be good to see the killing end. I think we can all agree on that. But I come back to, and I appreciate what you said about Mr. Trump trying to get people to the peace table. But do you, because you've been deeply involved in this, do you have a clear idea of what an acceptable peace plan would be?
I know there are requirements and red lines that the Russians have provided to Trump officials, and we are now working with the Ukrainian government to see what they're able to accept. But the negotiations with the Russians are at a very early stage. As you know, there was very little diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia during the Biden administration. The Trump administration has just begun this process, and I think it's going to be difficult. I don't know what the plan will be exactly. I think it's likely that there will be an agreement to set the borders at the current battle lines, that there may be European and non-European peacekeepers coming in there to verify a peace agreement. I think, you said earlier that sanctions may be lifted from Russia. Russia's going to have to make some concessions for that. I'm not sure what they are going to be. And I understand this is going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to accept. And can we say that this is the best and most moral and most just solution? It most certainly is not. But I think it is the best solution we can come up with for now. And what Kellogg and I have advocated, Ukraine should not give up any territorial claims. It should stick to all of its claims, that it get back all of its territory, understanding that that may not happen for a long time, and not after extensive negotiations that could take years.
And I'm interested in what you wrote, and it does give a basis for going forward. I thought it was very interesting. But I just wonder whether Mr. Trump is really following this script. I mean, we understand that if he's trying to handle the peace process, he has to be the honest broker. He's got to be the man in the middle, trying to bring the two sides together. But it concerns a lot of people, particularly I think on this side of the Atlantic, that he seems now to become more sympathetic to Mr. Putin than Mr. Zelensky. The U.S. has stopped military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. He's called Zelensky a dictator. He repeats the Kremlin line about Zelensky needing to call an election. And we don't see what equivalent pressure he's putting on Russia.
Well, I would say that Trump sees himself as a deal maker and thinks he has to maintain good relations with Putin. Not that he agrees with Putin, not that he disputes that Putin is the aggressor in this vicious war. But I think Trump is frustrated that Zelensky has not been willing to play ball in this process. And I understand Zelensky's position. Zelensky wants a just peace. He wants to see Russians put on trial for war crimes. I do too, and I'm sure you do. If there was a way to do that, I would sign on to that approach. I think the challenge now is to convince the Ukrainian leadership that this is difficult, but this is something that you have to do. This is the best approach for your people. The old way of doing things did not work. Now, the suspension of military aid and intelligence, the intelligence is intelligence that was being used to target bases and other targets in Russia, and the military aid is temporary. I think the suspension of intelligence assistance is also temporary to get Ukraine to the bargaining table and to let them know that the old way of doing things is over.
And yet we learn again, just to pile it on here, that Mr. Trump, we learned this morning, is planning to revoke the temporary legal status of 240,000 Ukrainians who fled the conflict in America. I mean, why would you do that at this stage before peace talks have even begun?
You know, I just read that. I don't know what the deal is with that, who is going to be sent back, or what the administration has in mind.
What concessions would you advise Mr. Trump, if you're in this position, to say to Mr. Trump, you must demand these concessions from Mr. Putin? What would they be?
Well, I'd like to see a buffer zone on both sides of the border where heavy weapons are removed. I think that would make it easier for peacekeepers to verify a peace agreement. I think there should be an exchange of prisoners as soon as possible. I would like to see, if we had an agreement to loosen sanctions on Russia, I think that the cost of that for Putin is that there would be a tax on, let's say, increased energy sales that would be used to rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine. I think Russia has to play a role in reconstructing Ukraine, and that's an issue I would make a top priority in peace talks.
Interesting. And we saw this morning, again, the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, saying that any concept of peacekeeping forces from NATO countries, as Mr. Starmer has been talking about British troops, Mr. Macron about French troops, hoping others would join, they would regard that as basically a NATO occupation of Ukraine, and it's not going to happen. I've always thought that was like the likely Russian reaction to be, but if that is the settled policy of the Kremlin, it would make that peacekeeping, the Starmer-Macron peacekeeping approach, it's dead in the water, is it not?
Well, there's a lot going on here. There's the idea
That's
of peacekeepers, which is what the UN would deploy. That these are blue helmets, lightly armed, and they're deployed with the consent of both parties. And I was always skeptical that the Russians would consent to the deployment of British troops on their border. However, Macron and Starmer have something else in mind. They would like to have an enforcement mission of European troops that would be deployed in addition to peacekeepers. This would be a force that would use military force against Russian forces if they violated a ceasefire agreement. I don't think there's any chance that Russia will agree to such a thing. And I heard from European think tanks yesterday that there's talk in Europe of deploying this force without Russian consent. It will simply be put in Ukraine. Russia will be informed of it. If this is the position of the French and British governments, there will be no peace.
No.
I don't like the idea of not having something to enforce an agreement, but I think we have to get Russian cooperation. But putting an offensive European force in Ukraine is something Russia will never agree to, and could be a guarantee that the war will never end.
I understand that. I would be amazed if that happened too. But we also learned that this morning, or maybe late last night, America time, that Mr. Trump had authorized some of his top aides to begin secret meetings with the Ukrainian opposition figures. It does seem in a number of ways that he's moving, that Mr. Trump, he would like to ease Zelensky out, replace him perhaps with somebody more pliable, which of course is the aim of the Kremlin as well. You quite rightly said this is very complicated, but I wonder sometimes if it doesn't come down to something quite simple and personal. Mr. Trump likes Mr. Putin. He dislikes Mr. Zelensky.
I don't think Trump and Zelensky get along for a variety of reasons. I hope that's going to change. I hope this report that there's any interest by Trump officials in meeting with Zelensky's opposition is not true. I'm aware of that report. I don't know that it's true.
You said in your paper, you argued, thought with a lot of sense, that the US should negotiate a peace aligned with US and Ukrainian interests by enabling Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength. These were your wise words. Quite hard to argue that that's what Mr. Trump is currently doing.
Well, and when I talked about negotiating from a position of strength, this goes against what I understand as a Russian position in the negotiations that Ukraine has to be disarmed. In my view, that is unacceptable. Ukraine has to be heavily armed to defend itself, to prevent another Russian invasion. So that is off the table. I also would argue that when you try to figure out what Trump's position is on Ukraine, and I can't read his mind. I'm not speaking for him today, I might add.
I understand.
He did bring on General Keith Kellogg, the co-author of this paper, to be his special envoy for Russia and Ukraine. I think that's significant because I like to assume that Trump read and absorbed this paper and liked what the general and I had to say, and I think that's promising for the peace process.
One final thing. Is it wise now for Europe, which I mentioned in my monologue, has taken a long while to realize that it needs to spend a lot more in defense? But in a way, the thinking's going beyond that, and they now begin to wonder if they need to try and keep NATO together without the United States at the top. Is Europe right to begin considering that the US is now not a reliable ally?
I think the US will always be a reliable ally for the UK and for NATO. Trump has said he would like Europe to take primary responsibility for defending NATO and providing lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine because of the enormous threat from China, which Trump would like to make a priority
Yes.
for U.S. defense. But that doesn't mean the U.S. is walking away from NATO or walking away from its historic and crucial relationship with our friends in Europe.
Fred, thank you for coming back on Times Radio again. It's been good to talk to you. Fred Fleitz, Vice Chair of the America First Policy Institute's Center for American Security.